Welcome to the 21st century. I'm assuming everyone listening to this is from the 21st century. After all, I'm pretty sure this video is not important enough to be watching during the 22nd century. But nonetheless, the purpose of this video is to cover people who I believe are the most influential of the first quarter of the century. Yeah, can you believe it? A quarter of the century has already passed. So let's figure out who are the most influential figures. I'm going to start off this video with someone you almost certainly have heard of, and that is Bill Gates. I mentioned in my previous video on the 20th century, Bill Gates of course founded Microsoft along with Paul Allen in New Mexico, which would eventually set up shop in Washington state. While Tim Berners-Lee made the internet accessible to ordinary people, Bill Gates and his team at Microsoft made the operating system of computers accessible to ordinary people through the use of Windows, as well as the implementation of digital office work being done at Microsoft Office. Now, oftentimes it's easy to overlook Microsoft Office as being something rather boring and mundane, and to be perfectly clear, Excel spreadsheets are boring, but nonetheless, they completely revolutionized work. It completely revolutionized our productivity and efficiency as well. It's really hard to underestimate that on top of that, during the 2000s, Microsoft had actually dealt with a lot of controversies, namely for its monopolistic practices. On top of that, it managed to actually mitigate some of the negative image by setting up Xbox. Yeah, really. You can thank Bill Gates for that as well. In the aftermath of much of the work in Microsoft, Bill Gates has moved on to philanthropy. He has had a reputation for being very charitable, and he has also been at the forefront of much of the discussion about medical technology throughout much of the developing world. However, he has also garnered a reputation for having somewhat of an anti-aesthetic, being the subject to numerous conspiracy theories, and by and large not particularly having the same degree of charisma as other tech giants, unlike, say, his main rival, Steve Jobs. Now, we all know Steve Jobs, the icon of Apple. What made Steve Jobs rather different than Bill Gates was that he was far more marketable. He by and large was seen as being more charismatic, and by and large could be a massive salesman, arguably the most famous salesman in human history. Keep in mind that during the 90s, Apple actually had quite a lot of problems, but it stepped up its game during the 2000s. Steve Jobs, after all, had been kicked out of the company that he started, but re-engaged in the company, and given his love of music and the Beatles, he focused on marketing the iPod. This would eventually morph into the iPhone and the MacBook. While controversial for his cutthroat office politics and pretty terrible attitude, he put Apple on the stage to becoming the world's largest company. However, he didn't do it alone. Another major figure was Steve Wozniak. Steve Wozniak is oftentimes overlooked, but he's arguably more important in the development of Apple on the hard tech side. While it's true he didn't play a significant role as a marketer, he did design Apple during the 1970s. So he's worth a mention just for that. Next on the list is far more controversial than Steve Wozniak, and that is George Bush. George Bush had been the governor of Texas and son of former President Senior Bush, who was basically elected president in one of the closest elections in U.S. history, 2000. He was seen as one of the most popular presidents during the beginning of his presidency, particularly in the aftermath of September 11th. However, his popularity eventually plummeted due to the Iraq War, the handling of Hurricane Katrina, and the 2008 financial crisis. He was, in many ways, a transformative president, but by and large, in the eyes of most historians, for the worst. By and large, he's considered to be one of the worst presidents in history. In fact, his party, the GOP, has largely abandoned his legacy in favor of Trumpism. However, his AIDS policy in Africa proved to be a success, and while being very unpopular around much of the world and the United States, he was still very popular in sub-Saharan Africa. Speaking of 9/11, we get to bin Laden, a Saudi Sunni fundamentalist who received aid from the US for fighting the Soviets during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But during the 1990s, he had become highly opposed to the US and the West in general. He wanted to implement a global Islamist system, somewhat similar to that of the Islamic Golden Age, as he was willing to orchestrate a number of terrorist attacks in order to do so. There were a number of them in Kenya and Tanzania, but this would eventually accumulate into the 9/11 attacks in New York City, which would result in the Afghanistan war, as he by and large was seeking refuge among the Taliban in Afghanistan. He was eventually killed by Navy SEALs in Pakistan. While bin Laden represented a very reactionary element of the Middle East, there were some figures in the Middle East who were actually seeking to modernize. One of the most overlooked is Sheikh Zayed, the founding father of the United Arab Emirates, home to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. See, while much of the Middle East was in turmoil over the early 21st century, at least during the 2000s, the UAE had remarkable development, stability, and prosperity alongside many other Gulf states. Partially due to oil revenue, but also due to stable governance and rule of law, they eventually came to a fairly successful and very stable nation state with strong institutions. Unfortunately, this oftentimes came at the cost of worker abuses, and in many ways the country is still highly authoritarian. Nonetheless, Dubai and Abu Dhabi have emerged to become some of the most prosperous and stable influential cities in the world, and are highly interwoven into the global economic system. Moving on back to the United States, we get to Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. Like Bill Gates, he was starting off his empire in Seattle, Washington state during the 1990s. He did so by selling books online, as they were non-perishable items, and he was an avid reader. Eventually, this online bookstore spread rapidly into nearly every facet of retail, becoming one of the greatest tech giants on the planet, making Bezos one of the top 5 wealthiest people in the world. Today, he's garnered a reputation as being both brilliant but rather cutthroat. Moving on to Larry Page, who deserves a position on this list, yet despite many of the others, doesn't really get as much recognition. He, alongside Sergey Brin, his Russian brethren, created the search engine that would compete with Yahoo and Ask Jeeves, and eventually beat them at their game. Larry Page remains one of the richest people in the world. However, he by and large stays out of the limelight in sharp contrast to many other tech giants, such as Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, and among Harvard's graduates, or dropouts more accurately. The website would start out in Harvard but spread out to other colleges and eventually would become the main source of private social media for millennials during the late 2000s and throughout the 2010s. This would eventually spread to nearly every other country with the exception of a few authoritarian regimes. However, it's garnered controversy over the use of ad revenue, oftentimes collecting data from its users, but nonetheless is still very popular. Today, its demographics are far older than they used to be, as younger people have gravitated towards Instagram, which Facebook bought, as well as TikTok, which is run by the Chinese Communist Party, the same government that bans Facebook. Next on the list is Barack Obama, the first black president who defeated John McCain in the 2008 election, running a campaign based off of optimism and hope, as he called it, in the wake of the foreign policy quagmires and economic recessions of the Bush administration. On the domestic level, he passed the Affordable Care Act, instituted limited reforms on the financial sector, and reversed some of the social policies put in place by his evangelical predecessor. On the foreign policy front, he increased the troops in Afghanistan while removing most of the troops from Iraq. He improved relations with Europe and other key U.S. allies, but received criticism for his drone policy, particularly in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Generally speaking, he is regarded as an above-average president. However, there is still time that needs to take place before we realize his full legacy. Another major Western leader is Angela Merkel, quite possibly the most influential and powerful woman of the 21st century so far. A chemist by trade, she transitioned into politics and became a central figure of the center-right Christian Democrat Party in Germany. She led Germany and other European nations throughout much of the recession and euro crisis, supporting austerity programs, oftentimes causing backlash in Greece and other South European nations. She also brought in Syrian refugees and migrants, which brought a great deal of praise at the beginning, but also a great deal of disdain as the years went by. Differences between the German population and the predominantly Muslim Syrian population created controversies. Her policies of rapprochement with Russia have also been controversial given the current war in Ukraine. But nonetheless, she has been seen as a chief leader of Western liberal democracy, especially since Trump became president and Brexit resulted in the UK leaving the European Union. Oftentimes, she is seen as a bulwark against some of the right-wing populism and authoritarian forces. And that leads me to another major figure on the European continent who arguably is even more influential than Merkel, and that is Vladimir Putin of Russia. Now, Putin started out as a former KGB agent during the Soviet days who would climb up the ranks to replace Boris Yeltsin as the first president of the Russian Federation after the Soviet Union collapsed. He would oversee a more successful transition away from communism to capitalism after Yeltsin had messed up the economy during the 90s. The economy improved, however, the system of corruption and authoritarianism continued. His first major endeavor would be during the Second Chechen War, in which the Russian military fought against Muslim separatists in Chechnya. He also would quasi-annex at least, two portions of the nation of Georgia in 2008 and took Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. He backed up Bashar al-Assad in Syria during the Syrian civil war and invaded Ukraine in 2022. The outcomes of this war are still unknown and it hasn't ended yet, but nonetheless it's proven to be quite a disaster. Next on the list is Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, one of the most powerful nations on earth. Saudi Arabia is one of the 20th largest economies on the planet and one of the largest reserves of oil and gas as well. It's home to Mecca and Medina, two of the holiest cities in Islam, making it the de facto leader of the Sunni Islamic world. Historically, the monarchy in Saudi Arabia has moved on from brother to brother, but this oftentimes led to stagnation. Replacing a 90-year-old with an 85-year-old again and again, by and large, leads to slow change. Mohammed bin Salman, through some Game of Thrones maneuvering, managed to break this system, changing it from father to son, or at the least uncle to son. Given the fact that he's in his 40s, he has more of a modern approach than many of his uncles. By and large, he is not too fond of preventing women from driving or going to work. He has allowed cinemas and concerts that were once banned in the kingdom to open up, and has forged closer ties with Israel to rival Iran. However, he has also done so by purging and sometimes killing political opponents, representing freedom of speech and freedom of the press, as many of his predecessors have done. On some level, he is emblematic of the seismic shift in much of the Arab world towards a more pragmatic modern vision, in which Saudi Arabia and its allies will retain Islamic traditions while adapting to the modern world for better or for worse. And speaking of adapting to modernity, we get to Pope Francis. The Catholic Church had a rough stretch during the 2000s and early 2010s. With child abuse scandals and a rapidly secularizing Western Europe, plummeting church attendance in the developed world, many started to question the leadership of Pope Benedict. Eventually, Pope Benedict abandoned his position, the first time in 600 years. Pope Francis would eventually become the first Pope of the Americas, or first Pope from the Americas as he's originally from Argentina. He would champion many modern causes such as climate change, and he would have a more tolerant approach of some forms of gay rights. He was also fairly well known for being tolerant of various religions and more open to scientific evidence. This has led to a resurgence of the Catholic Church's popularity even among some secular circles. However, it's still too early to tell in the long run. Next on the list is Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, and the most prominent founder of any public social media website, the town square of the digital world, and especially for the elite. And while it's true that he's no longer the head of Twitter, he still set up the foundations of Twitter, which is now known as X, which leads us to the next character, Elon Musk. Do I really need to talk about this guy? He has been the pivotal figure in the creation of PayPal along with some other people, as well as Tesla, solar energy, and public transit. He put electric cars, in particular, on the map through Tesla. However, his reputation has been, let's just say, rather controversial. Since he bought Twitter and turned it into X, he has been somewhat of a right-wing culture warrior, loved by many and hated by others, which leads us to another pivotal figure that he is aligned with, Donald Trump. Donald Trump has been one of the most influential figures when it comes to changing America's political landscape. What was once a set of Republican policies based off of aggressive military interventions and free markets have moved on to one that is by and large isolationist and based around protectionist trade policies. Now, I'm not going to discuss Trump too much because his story is still unraveling to this day, as we can expect him in the White House in January. So, I'm going to move on to the next person on the list. No, not Joe Biden. Let's move on. Not Donald Trump again. Narendra Modi. There we go. The Prime Minister of India, who was focused on implementing more business-friendly policies in the largest country in the world in terms of population. Modi is a Hindu nationalist, which oftentimes is seen as an ideology which is fairly anti-Muslim. He has been neutral during the Russo-Ukraine War and has joined the Quad alongside the United States, Australia, and Japan to counter Chinese influence. He is another figure whose story still has a lot of telling to do. So, I'm gonna move on to the next person, Joe Rogan, who is the biggest podcaster in the world, oftentimes seen as the Oprah for young men, a demographic that has been by and large marginalized by the mainstream media. His political and social views don't really fit into one clear ideology, but nonetheless, he has proven to be controversial given his influence during the COVID-19 pandemic. You know what's also controversial? Ukraine. And now we get to Vladimir Zelensky, a former comedian turned comedic actor who played the president of Ukraine, who eventually became the actual president of Ukraine. Zelensky has led his nation throughout the ongoing unprovoked Russian invasion. This war is far from over. His nation, however, has proven to be far more resilient than previously thought. The Russian military, once hailed as the second best in the world, has been continuously humiliated in what was thought to be a 3-week war. Nonetheless, the war is kind of a slugfest at this point. And speaking of slugfests, we have to get to another major figure, Benjamin Netanyahu, one of the largest running prime ministers in Israeli history, known for his support of the Israeli far right, particularly on foreign policy issues. He has become deeply unpopular both in Israel and abroad. Nonetheless, he has retained a great deal of electoral power. His story still has a lot of telling to do. So I'm going to move on before this comment section becomes more of a shit show than it already will be. Moving on to Jack Ma. Jack Ma was the founder of Alibaba, the Amazon of China, and a major symbol of China's global interconnection and ingenuity. However, after outshining the Chinese Communist Party leaders, he was forced to step down. This was oftentimes seen by many in a way in which the Chinese Communist Party ensures that it maintains hegemonic control over the country, even outshining billionaires. Another group of people that belong on the list are the founders of YouTube, Stephen Chen, Joe Ed Karim, and Chad Hurley. If it wasn't for them, this totally insignificant YouTube video wouldn't exist. And the last major figure in this series is, of course, Xi Jinping. Is my microphone working? Is the Chinese Communist Party trying to cut out my mic